and we will have more people join us as we come along. So I'm just going to kick off because we just have the hour and the time does go very quickly. So first of all, on behalf of Grow Remote, I would like to thank you all for joining us here today and to welcome you to our panel discussion on the future of remote. Can hybrid really work? Born from an idea in 2017, established in 2018, Grow Remote is a not-for-profit organisation on a mission to enable, work, live and participate locally. We do this by making remote work visible and accessible. Grow Remote is active in over 100 local communities and to date has hosted over 400 events, trained managers in more than 40 companies, and trained hundreds of new entrants to remote working. We're about to take the next step in the evolution of ways of working. Open debate, sharing experience and data, and supporting organisations as the body economic navigates the next frontiers in our world of work. I'd like to extend a massive thank you to all of our panelists today, kindly giving of their time. And now I'm delighted to introduce your host for the next 60 minutes, Jennifer Dowling, organisational psychologist and director of Train Remote. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Renata, and welcome everybody to today's event. This event, I suppose, has been the result of an ongoing conversation between myself and Renata, different clients and organizations over the last few months. And I suppose the big question on everyone's mind is, how do we make hybrid work? But for me, there was a bigger question around, can hybrid actually work? So we thought it might be interesting to bring together some folks who have some opinions on that very subject. So we have a panel with us today who have kindly joined us. With us, we have Helene Haughney, Chief Operations Officer for NearForm. And a lot of you would be familiar with NearForm. They've been a remote first company for nearly 10 years now, I think, Helene, and have been, I think, probably trailblazers in the space of remote and remote first workplaces. Also falling into that trailblazer category is John Riordan, and he's the Director of Support at Shopify. And Shopify launched their fully remote operation in 2015. But John has been a significant, I think, advocate and expert in the area of remote working for a number of years. We're also really lucky to have with us today Tatiana Andreeva, and Tatiana is an associate professor and research director at Maynooth University. And I suppose over the last couple of months, and probably for a longer period of time, Tatiana has been looking at and tracking data in relation to knowledge sharing in hybrid, in remote, and in office-based environments. So she's going to share with us today some of her literally, I think, hot off the press research in relation to data they've put together over the last couple of months. Finally, we have Joanne Mangan with us. And Joanne is the employer lead at Grow Remote and brings a kind of wide industry perspective, I think, on this question. Joanne's own kind of background and perspectives in relation to diversity and inclusion, I think, also add an interesting slant to the conversation today as well. So welcome to the panel. Thank you very much for joining us, and welcome to you all who are joining us as audience members today. In terms of how the session will run, each speaker is going to have 5 or 6 minutes where they're going to answer that question and talk to that question of, can hybrid work? Then we'll have a little bit of a panel discussion, and then we're hoping to get some questions from our audience. So as we go through the session and as speakers are talking, please feel free to put your questions into the chat. Renata is going to try and put those together and look at key themes, and we'll try and make sure we get to as many of your questions as possible. So without further ado, we're going to start with Helena, if that's okay. So Helena, over to you in terms of that question, I suppose, can hybrid work?
Thanks, Jennifer. Good afternoon, everyone. So I am Helene Haughney. I'm the COO at NearForm. I am, first and foremost, I'm a parent. So I have a 10-year-old son. I live in Waterford, and I've worked remotely for over 10 years now in many different guises. So I think I've tried them all. I've done the working, going into an office every day. I have done the hybrid model where, to be honest, I was an afterthought. And I've also now, which I'm doing now, is the remote first. I work for a company called NearForm. So we are, just to give you a small bit of information about NearForm, we're a global software services company. We take clients from idea to solution using modern and pragmatic technologies and tools. Our DNA is really in full stack web platforms. So we work with our clients on open source, and we lead them through how to navigate that open source world. But also one of the things that we bring to all of our project teams is that remote working model. So we really help some of our clients embrace remote working, and we pass over some of our knowledge and experience on that. So as I said, we are in NearForm. We've been doing it's a remote first company. So we've been working remotely for 10 years. I think we're doing a pretty good job on it. We're spread over 22 countries. We have a fully distributed model. And so that's my background. So that's where I'm coming from. So I'm firmly in the fully remote box. But when Joanne asked me to speak here, I put a lot of thought into it. So I really have been pondering, can hybrid really work? From my own personal experience, I would say no, but that's because I had a poor experience 10 years ago working for a company in Dublin where there were a few of us. In order to bring in some talent, they kind of had to let us work remotely, but it didn't work. We were an afterthought. But like considering where we are now, I know things have moved on quite a bit and people do want the mix of being able to work at home and go into an office. Then businesses kind of have to find a way to make it work. And that's what I'm a little bit worried about, is the motivation for doing it, because I don't want us to destroy the remote first model in favor of going back into an office. And I don't want to be here in a couple of years saying, listening to businesses and reading articles saying, oh, well, we tried that working from home thing and it didn't really work for our business, when really what they're trying to do, and probably doing it half-heartedly, is a hybrid model. So I am such an advocate for remote first, but I would find it hard to go back into an office. So some of the things that I guess as a remote working company that we've addressed are things like setting up home offices, looking at the health and safety aspects of working from home, socialization, meetups, the collaborative working, over communicating, handling those tough conversations. So as managers, how do you do those remotely? Career advancement, promotion, working with the management team, and even down to compensating a remote workforce. There's so many things you need to think of when you're working remotely. It's not easy, I totally get that, but I do think NearForm, I think we have a good handle on it, but we're always trying to improve it. So some of the challenges I think that other companies will face, after being forced to work remotely for such a long period over the last 18 months, how can we keep everyone happy? So with the hybrid model, I think some of the things that I'd be worried about is that employees will feel unsettled or disengaged from their team. How will managers manage their teams if half of them are in the office, half of them are at home on different days? Maybe they all come to work on the same day. Maybe they all come to the office on the same day and then they work from home on the same days. Are they always using video for everything? So for meetings, whether you're in the office or at home, our video is always on. Will you lose that whole spontaneity of let's just have a quick meeting to discuss this? Will the people working from home feel like they're missing out on something? And not even to mention office space and shared desks and hot desks and on all that you have to face and think about. There was an article I read last year, one written by McKinsey, and they talked about the hybrid model. And one of the things they mentioned that really stayed with me was this risk of two different cultures emerging in a hybrid model. So one where, you have the in-person workers and the managers who are in the office and they benefit from the positive elements of co-location and that in-person collaboration, while then the remote workers start to feel isolated, maybe disenfranchised and unhappy. And you have these two distinct cultures that are forming. And so how do you prevent that from happening? Because that's just not a good place for either in office or at home. So we do have an opportunity, I think, to try and work out how would hybrid really work? How can it work for small businesses and for, outside the tech space, even like for other companies and other industries, how can they make it work? So while I do recognize there are many challenges for companies doing remote first, and that they feel hybrid is the stepping stone to make an effort to do it effectively, or the hybrid is kind of maybe their stepping stone, and that they're going to try this out first before maybe they'd even consider doing fully remote. But what I would say is learn from other companies that have done the remote thing remote first well, learn from their mistakes, learn from their wins. And if you're going to do it, just make the effort to do it well and don't do it half-heartedly, because nobody wins in that scenario.
Super. Thank you, Helene.
No worries, Jennifer.
So that takeaway really being, learn from the mistakes of others and people who've kind of gone before in terms of remote and remote first as well. So.
Yeah, most definitely. And things like this are really useful. Listen to other companies that have done it well and what mistakes they've made.
Great. Super. Thank you, Helene. John, can we bring you in?
Sure. Hi there. My name is John Riordan. I'm with Shopify. Just to give you a bit of background, Shopify was a completely office-based company until about 2015, and took the first step into remote work about 6 years ago. And interestingly enough, now the whole company, since March of last year, the decision was made to move everybody remote immediately, and of course in light of the pandemic. But then within a month, the decision was made to move the company fully remote. So what we had was a collision of two cultures, really. You had a support organization, which was about 40% of the company, which was fully remote and had been remote for a long time. And everybody there was there intentionally. They had chosen the remote world, the remote pathway. Yet you had 60% of the organization, which was resolutely office-based. So you had those folks then being absorbed into an overall remote organization. So we've learned a lot and seen a lot from how people have actually developed and morphed, and how attitudes have moved and changed. One thing I think, just from an Irish perspective, first of all, to think about, a lot of folks who work in Ireland, who work for multinationals, need to understand and recognize that to a large extent, they're actually ahead of the curve in terms of understanding and getting remote work, because invariably your leaders or a lot of the decision making is made in a different country, in a different time zone, and you've got the mindset built in the DNA to understand an element of remoteness. Now, it's not fully remote, but it's an element of remoteness. So I think it's a critical advantage that we have. I would echo exactly what Helene said about the concept of being an afterthought. In the old days, if I go back to 3 or 4 years ago, there was nothing more dispiriting than being the one person who's up on the board when the other 10 people are in the room. You are so not part of the conversation, and I don't care how well it was organized, it just wasn't the case. Personal story: when I joined Shopify, I was the only remote director in the world, and I was routinely attending meetings where I was the only person not in the room, and there might be like 2 or 3 conference rooms of people in the same building, and then me being remote. So I was missing up on multi-layered kind of body language signs and a little bit of banter on the side. And about 3 months in, I was doing a review with my lead at the time, and I just said, look, we need to, for this particular one meeting that we do on a weekly basis, everybody go to their desk and do it from there. And we never ever went back. And it actually gave us the impetus to really drive on for proper, what I call democratizing communication, which is what it was. Everybody was on a level playing field. I was chatting with our team here at Shopify a couple of minutes ago, and I asked, and I was explaining to them about what should I share with folks from outside of Shopify about their general view, and this is a remote team, their general view on whether hybrid would work. And the points that came across are quite interesting. They all talked about it adding to the freedom for a remote worker to know that there was a place to go to actually feel involved. And the term congregation point was used, and the term release valve was used. But what I would postulate in this discussion is that you don't need an office to do that, but you need to recognize that it needs to be done. Now, I used to always be really envious of what NearForm, every time there was an article on NearForm 2 or 3 years ago, it would be a picture of a boat, of a ship in somewhere in the Mediterranean, and the story would be, oh, NearForm brings all their employees on a, on a junket every year. It was the classic, what I call lazy journalism. But it wasn't about going on a junket. It was about getting people together in a place that was attractive. The companies that are going to succeed are the companies that actually learn how to take an aspect of remote work and actually make it work for them. So I'm also going to agree with Helene that I actually don't think hybrid is correct. And let me just explain why. There's about 20%, and I'm going to give rough numbers just so that I don't upset anybody. About 20% of people absolutely resolutely, I must work remote and I'll never go back to an office. Approximately 20% of people going, I hate this remote shit. I don't ever want to work remote. I want to go back to the office. 60% of the people in the middle, this big, large, massive swing vote. Now, what's actually happening is hybrid doesn't offend anybody in the 60%. The only thing that's going to happen over the course of the next couple of years with this mythical 60% is they will work out over time what suits them best. And the companies that adapt best to gathering this 60% it's going to shift that the larger number of that more towards remote or more towards office. And I think that is the essence of it. So what are the points that are going to win in all of this? Or what are the keys to winning? And I think it's actually down to talent and the talent wars. And what you'll find is from companies that have set out their stall to be resolutely remote, they will tell you privately and quietly, they will tell you that the uptick in both volume of applicants and the quality of applicants since March of last year, when you've set out your stall being resolutely remote, the quality and quantity has increased quite considerably. That to me is going to be the ultimate result. And I would say we're seeing fairly early indications that talent, and what I'm talking about is the right talent, the talent that's going to move businesses, they're voting with their feet to come to companies that are meeting their needs. And this is where the point of freedom comes in. Ultimately, the best talent is completely free in terms of constraints, not free, they're very expensive, but they're free in terms of constraints. And they will find their natural, like water, it'll find its natural place eventually. And I believe that the natural place is probably in the short term, short to medium term, is in hybrid for those who haven't fully decided yet. But long term, it's going to lean in more towards remote. So for me, I would describe hybrid as actually the entry-level drug to long-term remote work. Jennifer?
Great, thanks, John. I like that, hybrid as the entry-level drug to remote working. So thanks for that, John. I think your points around talent are really interesting, and again, something we'll really come back to when we get into the questions. Tatiana, John talked there about the democratization of communication and things like that. Communication within organizations is kind of your area of expertise. Can I hand over to you maybe for some input?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jennifer. As Jennifer mentioned, over the last almost a year, with my colleague Paula Zappa here in the School of Business in Maynooth University, we were doing a longitudinal study trying to understand how do people react to all of these changes that are happening to their work arrangements. Some people always work remote, and COVID didn't bring any changes to them. Some people remained in never remote, even during COVID, in essential jobs, and some people moved. And we were interested to see what has happened. So I'm very happy to share with you some very first insights from this study. And let me share with you, I prepared the slides because I thought talking of the data will be easier visually. Can you confirm if you can see the slides?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Tatiana.
Perfect. So first of all, just to give you a very quick background of the study so you know where the data comes from. So we did a survey of employees in UK across various industries, across various organizations. The only criteria were that the people had to be in full-time employment, and we were looking for anybody who is over 25 because we wanted to avoid, students in the type of temporary employments that they often have. And from the beginning of the study, because we wanted to do a comparison, we intentionally recruited 3 groups of relatively the same size. We were looking for people who are fully remote, for people who are never remote, and people who are hybrid. So from this perspective, it is of course not representative of how it all looks in the population, because as you can imagine, these 3 groups are not equally represented, but we needed this to make a proper comparison. And we were asking people basically 2 groups of questions. On the one hand, some of their behaviors or performance questions, how they evaluate their work performance, their creativity at work, and their sharing of knowledge with colleagues. And also we asked them about different perceptions of their job characteristics. How do they think, how do they feel about their job? And we collected data at several time points. The first data collection was in November 2020, which is 8 months post-pandemic. But we asked people about their work arrangement now, but also about their work arrangement pre-pandemic. And then we did 2 more waves, 3 months later, and then 3 more months later. So the latest data collection was in June, and what you're going to see is really hot off press of the first analysis. So first of all, let's have a look how these 3 groups differ in terms of their work behaviors and performance. First of all, and this is what you don't see in the slide because there are no differences, the self-evaluation of their work performance didn't differ across any groups. So they all were the same. But where we found differences were in the knowledge sharing with the colleagues and in the self-evaluated creativity at work. And we entered this study thinking we're going to compare 3 groups, fully remote, hybrid, and never remote. But then we realized this actually needs to be taken in a bit more nuanced way. Because group that is never remote, these are the people who were never remote in COVID, but they also were never remote pre-COVID. So it is their normal work arrangement, and they continued through this, through all of these months, right? People in hybrid were a mix. Some of them always work in hybrid and remained in hybrid, and some of them were moved to hybrid from never remote. And then the fully remote group also included the people who were always remote and the people who were moved, forced to work fully remote because of COVID. And this is where the interesting differences come. So the people who work during COVID in hybrid, there were no differences whether they always worked hybrid or they moved to hybrid. But within the fully remote group, there were very big differences depending whether fully remote was original, as Joanne put, purposeful decision pre-COVID, and they always worked like this, or whether they were forced to move it due to COVID. So what you can see that the people who always worked remotely, as well as the people who were forced to move to to remote from never remote, which is this box that graduates from yellow to blue. These are the people who are really sharing with their colleagues much less. And the groups who are never remote, who are hybrid, and the people who moved from hybrid to fully remote are sharing their knowledge with colleagues really a lot. And in terms of creativity, the picture looks different. And again, the hybrid groups and also the people who moved from fully remote, either from moved to fully remote, either from never remote or from hybrid, they self-evaluate being very creative at work. People who never work remotely self-evaluate the creativity really, really low, below the average. And the always remote is just a tiny bit below the average. So I was thinking of the question that Jennifer asked us today, would hybrid work? And if you look at this picture, you think, oh, actually, it looks like hybrid works because, it seems to get better of the whole world. But I have to tell you, I think the situation is a bit more complicated because here we are looking also at the short-term consequences of this move. People were adjusting to COVID, everybody was stressed and everybody was trying to pull their weight and to do their best and not to lose the job. So this needs to be treated in the context. Where I think it becomes really important, if we look at the different job characteristics, how people perceive them, because we know from research that these are very important predictors of long-term performance. And here the story with the hybrid becomes much more pessimistic, I have to say. So again, as you see, we split the fully remote group into 3 subgroups, depending how they worked pre-COVID. And what we know from our study that people who are in hybrid and people who had to move to fully remote have much higher role overload and much higher role conflict. And the groups who basically didn't experience any changes because they either stayed remote as they were, or they stayed never remote as they were, they fare much better in this regard. And we know that role overload and role conflict have very significant impact on long-term performance, on employee turnover intentions, and things like this. So basically, it means that in long term, these groups, the companies with employees in these groups might risk losing these people. Also, everybody who was during COVID in fully remote, irrespectively of whether they were always like this or moved into this position, they had much higher job insecurity. You know, they feared that they can lose their job at any time. And again, we know that these are important predictors of long-term behaviors at work. And finally, all who were in different hybrid or remote conditions perceived that they task visibility, which is how well they think their manager knows what they are doing and what are their achievements. This was much lower compared to people who are never remote. And I think this has also important consequences, for example, for our performance evaluations, when we are either in hybrid or in fully remote. So I stop here. I think I've given enough food for thought, and I would be happy to discuss more if you have questions.
That's great, Tatiana. Thank you. Really interesting information there, and really interesting to see how that research will play out again over the next kind of 12, 18 months as well. So thank you. And as Tatiana said, if anybody has any questions on anything that John or Helene or Tatiana have said, please put them into the chat, and we're going to get to them in a minute. The last of our panel, last but not least, is Joanne Mangan from Grow Remote. So Joanne, in answer to that question, what do you think? Can hybrid work?
Thanks, Jennifer. So I'll just touch a little bit on Grow Remote and what we do just briefly before I get into the hybrid topic. So Grow Remote, as you said at the start, we're a non-profit organization. We're on a mission to make remote work visible and accessible to everybody, regardless of where they live. And we're very passionate about remote work as a driver of social change. So that means we see benefits of remote work for individuals, we see it for employers, there's a strong business case there, but we also see the benefits of remote work for the wider society. In particular, we talk about communities. So remote work has potential to really transform rural and regional communities in Ireland, to build thriving local communities, because when you unlock jobs from urban centres, from Dublin, from Galway, from Limerick, make those available to anybody, anywhere, then people living in rural areas have opportunity and access to opportunity that they didn't have in the past, and people have opportunity to move and live where they want to live in their local community, spend money in their local community, which in turn helps drive local economies. We also see remote work as a great driver of diversity and inclusion, which is a hot topic, very important for a lot of business leaders today. Remote work, it democratizes opportunity, not only by location, but also for people who may, for various reasons, may not have been able to thrive in the pre-pandemic traditional 9-to-5 office environment. By that, I mean, for example, people who have caring responsibilities, people who have young children, for example, people who look after elderly parents. I have to highlight there predominantly that would be women. Also people who have, for other reasons, like for reasons of disability, illness, members of marginalized communities. There are a lot of people out there who have not been able to thrive in that traditional 9-to-5, and remote work can open up the doors to them to be able to build their careers and have equal access to those opportunities. So I can talk all day about the benefits of remote work, but we're here to talk about hybrid. And my point of view on hybrid is, I think the reality is we need to look at where businesses are at today. And as John said, it looks like that 60%, depending on what research you look at, somewhere between 60-65% of employers want to bring in a hybrid model. And it's not just employers. around the same percentage of employees are also saying they want a hybrid model. I think it's important to note that research by NUIG recently also showed even higher than the 20% that John mentioned. Actually 30% of the respondents wanted to work fully remote, so that number is growing. But the reality is hybrid is where we're at. Hybrid is what the majority want. I think it's important to note a couple of points on that. Number one is I'd be very interested to see what that will look like in a year's time, because I think the coming year is going to be the hybrid experiment. I think we're coming out of a pandemic. That's the next point. So people are dying to get back to the office. They're dying to have interaction with other people. We've all been cooped up for the last year and a half. So I think hybrid is where we're at today, but I don't know what that means in terms of where we'll be in a year. So if hybrid is what people want, I think it's really important to highlight the fact that hybrid is very hard. It is what people want, but it's a very difficult model to implement. And the previous speakers before me have touched on quite a lot of these. And I think the risk there is, if hybrid is not implemented correctly by employers, then those benefits that I talked about in terms of communities, in terms of diversity and inclusion, in terms of democratizing opportunity, those benefits will not be realized. So I'll give you an example. If I work for an organization and they mandate that everybody has to be in the office 3 days a week, well, then I can't live where I want. I can't live in the west of Ireland if I have to drive to Dublin 3 days a week. I also, if I have childcare responsibility, if I have other impediments that make it difficult for me to thrive in a 9 to 5, if I have to go into the office 3 days a week, I don't get to realize those benefits and that flexibility. But that's not to say that hybrid won't work. So if you ask me, can hybrid work? I think my answer would be none of us really know, because we're just at the beginning of this journey. We're at the very early stages of planning for this hybrid experiment. And I think the next year will really tell how that's going to go. I think what we need to understand now, and what employers need to know, is how to do it correctly so that they can try and mitigate those risks. They can try and realize those benefits, give those benefits to their employees. They can retain their talent. So how do they do it right? That's the big question. And I think that's something that a lot of people on this call want to know. I have to say, we don't have all the answers. I think anyone who says they do is not being completely honest, because there's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of what ifs. But I think a very important first step for any organization who's thinking about bringing in a hybrid model is to adopt a remote first approach. Helen touched on this, and I'm sure people have seen this. It's been in the media a lot. There's been a lot of conversation about remote first. But for an organization to successfully implement hybrid, they really need to adopt this remote first approach. So what does that mean? There's lots of different elements to it. I think the first is, don't be office centric. So remove the office as the center of gravity, center of power, the center of decision making. That's how it's been for decades, but that needs to be changed. So you can still have your office. Companies want to keep their office, employees want an office to go to, but don't make the office the center of the universe. It's just another place that people go to work. Some people are at home, some people are in the office. You need to keep the balance equal between the different locations that people are in. And that will mitigate the risk of the people that I talked about who may have challenges in terms of having access to the workforce in the pre-pandemic times. That means they won't be disadvantaged, because you need to be really careful if you have a workforce where you have two different ways of working. You're working in the office and you've got people working at home, that there's no two-tiered workforce there, that the people who are working from home have equal access to opportunity, to information, to knowledge, to their managers, to communication, that everyone has equal access regardless of where they live. And there's lots of different things companies can do. We can talk about that a little bit. I'm sure people may have questions on that. Practical things like, have everyone if you have a meeting, have everyone dial in no matter where they are. Don't have some people in a conference room. I've had that experience myself, where I was the only one working remotely, and I would dial in from home and I couldn't hear people mumbling in the background and having conversations in low voices, and I'm shouting going, can you speak up? I can't hear you. So I've been there myself. So don't have that environment. Have everybody be on, when you have your meetings, make sure everybody is dialing in. Another really important point that I'd like to make here is, if you're a company that has a hybrid model, you have some people in the office, some people at home, you should still aim as much as possible and as much as practical to advertise your roles as locationless and keep those roles as locationless. I've said this a few times in other events that I've been to. The roles are remote, not the people. And what I mean by that is, you may have an employee who today you've opened it up to everybody to be flexible. You said, what do you want? John says, I want to come into the office 5 days a week. Mary says, I want to work from home 3 days a week. That's fine. That's up to them. But if John or Mary leave the company, that when you advertise that job, you advertise it as a remote job. And whoever comes in to take on that position has the flexibility then to choose. So the role stays remote. What we'd like to see at Grow Remote is when I go onto an employer's website and I look in their jobs page, I see jobs, Dublin, Cork, Galway, whatever, but I also see remote, 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 remote. And that's how you unlock those jobs and make those jobs available to people, regardless of where they are. So that's a very hard thing to manage as well. And I think a very important action that employers need to take is they need to train their managers. So I've worked as a people manager, and I can really empathize with a manager who's now in this situation where they're bringing in a hybrid model. Suddenly it's all about flexibility. People can choose where they want to be. Somebody might be hot desking one day, somebody's working from home. For a lot of managers, that is a complete nightmare because it goes against how they manage. And I think managers need to be trained, they need to be coached, they need to be brought along so that they can understand it's not about, I can see somebody in front of me so I know they're working. It's not about presenteeism, it's about productivity. That when you're thinking about people from promotions, that you're making sure you're thinking about everybody, the people who are remote and the people who are in the office. So training and coaching for managers, I think, is key. And I also, one final point to make before I finish up is companies should be looking at their own data. So who is asking for remote and why? I take this back to the diversity and inclusion point, because before the pandemic, traditionally, women would have requested flexible working more than men. There's always been a culture of if there's young children, predominantly, not always, but predominantly, the women would take the flexible option, the men would continue to work full time. So that's just one example where you need to be careful about your own employees and take a look at who's asking for remote and why, and make sure that nobody is disadvantaged or marginalized, and take a look at the gender lines or some of the other areas I talked about in terms of disability or people who have illnesses. Just make sure they're still included, that you have a fully inclusive organization. And also, are your younger people, you may have trainees, you may have graduates, are they all asking to come into the office, and why? Do they think that that's the only way that they're going to get mentorship? That's the only way to get coaching? Again, that's about your culture. If you build a culture where that is the case, then that's what will happen. But if you make sure you have a culture where people can choose to work from home, whether they're young, whether they're older, whether they're male, female, whatever it is, but that everybody knows that there's equal access to opportunity and knowledge and information. Thanks, Jennifer.
Great, Joanne. Thank you so much. And I really like what you said. We have a lot of advocates here on the panel for remote, and I'm one of them. But you know, I think, you know, we have to meet people where they're at right now, and the data is saying that, you know, hybrid is what organizations are looking at, what employees are looking for, and how do we do that well. So I think you made some really good points, you know, about not making the office the center of the universe, giving managers good training and support, advertising remote roles, you know, having that remote first approach to communication. And your last point that I think is really important is just around, you know, looking at our data, looking at what people are telling us, and what insights we can get from that. I'd love to throw it open to the wider panel, you know, in terms of those things that we can do now, given where we're at and given that hybrid looks like it's going to be a reality for a lot of organizations. What might be the practical things that organizations need to consider in the current environment?
Jennifer, I'll jump in on that one. I'll just give you an example of something that we were doing at Shopify pre-pandemic, and I think it's going to really carry over once some of the restrictions are lifted. For about the last 3 or 4 years, we have done a thing called Popup Office. So we're spread, and we're in 26 counties in Ireland. We've got people everywhere. And we do a thing called Popup Office, which is essentially once a month in most of the conurbations that we're in. We will host a session, and we let the folks in that area organize it themselves. We cover the cost of whether it be at a hotel conference room or a room in a Chamber of Commerce building or a co-working space. It doesn't matter. It's just essentially a conference room, or essentially it's just a collection point. And we would set that up for the day. We would actually have some Shopify banners just to make people feel welcome. I mean, we're talking about all stuff that's cheap and cheerful. Renting a room, throwing up a couple of banners, organizing the room, be it U-shaped or classroom shaped, whatever it is, and then have people go in and do their job in this particular room. What it affords people the opportunity to do is scratch that community itch, scratch the itch of belonging. And what we find is about a third of people actually are really interested in it and will come on a regular basis. About another third will come 1 in every 3, and about another third don't have much interest. And that's totally fine. But what it does is it affords everybody the opportunity to stay involved and engaged if they choose, and when they choose, and at the volume that they choose. One of the very interesting things is when we actually pulled it back at one stage, the group that complained the most were the folks who had never been to one of these sessions, because it was a case of, well, that's kind of my pressure release point, or if I ever need to connect, I can do it, and you're now taking that away. And that's a case of meeting people where they actually want to be met. Now, just to give you an example, this was 2019. We did, I think, 95 different pop-up sessions in Ireland, mainly Cork. We did monthlies in Cork, Limerick, and Dublin, and we did weekly ones in Galway because we have a lot of folks on the Western Seaboard. And the total cost of that was under 100 grand. So it was less than the fully allocated cost of 2 frontline customer support folks. So it's a throw-in in terms of cost, but what it actually gave us was a full connection for those people who wanted to stay connected. So there are simple practical things that you can do to enable people to stay connected, and it doesn't require that you have to have an office to do it, because to the point that Joanne was saying and Helene was saying, by simply having an office, you're creating a place where people are naturally going to congregate, and all it takes is 1 or 2 senior folk to position themselves in the office a little bit more than they should. And what's going to happen is the mushroom cloud will build around it, and Billy from finance will know that, or will believe that the only way that they're going to be able to advance is if the CFO is in the office. I need to be there all the time to be seen. It's going to be leader led, and that's a very important point. And so I would say to the point that to accentuate the points that have been made, it doesn't need to be an office. So hybrid can work if there isn't an office, but if there is intentional connection points built into the communication.
Great. Thanks, John. I think there's 2 points you made there that stick out to me. It's that intentional connection points, but also it's the behavior of leaders too, and how we consider that in a hybrid environment, because I think you're right. And the research, and I'm sure Tatiana can probably talk to this as well, the research supports that, you know, if our senior leadership team are in the office, then we're all going to be drawn back in as well. So it's a really, really important point. To the rest of the panel on that question, anybody want to come in?
I wouldn't mind, Jennifer. I think just from experience, I guess that the meetups and the collaboration is really important. So like we would, like, and pre-pandemic, for example, we'd have smaller project teams. They would meet up before every project. So they might meet twice a year for 3 or 4 days. We would also have like company, you know, like I know John mentioned earlier on, but we do NearFest every year. And that's something that has come from our CEO and founder. That is really, really strong about that. The whole company come together, usually in September, and we pick a nice location. We haven't been able to do that for the last couple of years, but we've been doing it virtually. So we've adapted even our kind of remote first way of working, because during a pandemic, we weren't able to do meetups. So we haven't been able to do that. So yes, we have been doing more on Zoom in terms of virtual meetups and socializing and stuff, but also it feeds into where you're hiring people. Like, I know I talk about, like, I think that's a lovely idea that you do in Shopify, John. It's really, we do something similar, I guess, with people. We have pods of people where we hire. We tend to, it's been a little bit kind of just organic, but now we're purposely doing it. We're hiring in areas so that you have people that if they want to meet for lunch, or they want to meet for a coffee in a month, every month or something, they could do that. They might only have to drive 30 minutes to meet each other. So finding locations around the globe, let's say, that kind of work for us to do that, and hiring a lot of people around a county or a region. So like we have a lot of people in Italy, they're all meeting up themselves. They're organizing a meetup in September just so that they can just reach out and see each other again. So but that comes from the top down. So our leadership team are every week when we do comms to the company, we're talking about, don't forget to do your meetups. There's budget there. We're happy to pay for it. Meet up, talk to your line manager, figure out how you want to do that, how you want to catch up. That's safe at the moment until we get back to where we can travel and meet each other officially and stuff. And it's rarely in an office. It's rarely in an office.
I think just on that point as well, when we talk about meeting employers where they're at, I do think it is important to recognize a lot of companies have invested a lot of money in their real estate. There's a lot of organizations in Ireland who have headquarters, head offices, even more so if you look at Silicon Valley or somewhere like that. I mean, the amount of money that's gone into some of those offices is just astronomical. So I think there's an evolution that's going to have to happen, and it's going to take some time. With the pandemic, it was like the Big Bang. It all came on us all of a sudden, but now I think we need to take it back to the beginning, the early stages of life, and look at it from an evolutionary point of view. It's a slow process. Companies are not ready, I think, to give up on the HQ. I think there's a mindset change there in a lot of ways, especially in Ireland. Ireland has been fantastic for bringing in foreign direct investment. We've got great sales and service and support centers here for some of the top tech companies. Their EMEA headquarters are here. They like their HQ because they bring visitors over. It generates more services for them, more business for them. So I think we need to recognize, I hear a lot, the office is dead, or the office is dead. I don't think the office is dead just yet, but I think companies need to reimagine what they do with their office. So don't, as I said already, don't make it be the center of the universe, but you can leverage it as a place for people to meet, for people to collaborate. But for solo work, for people doing their day-to-day, it doesn't need to be the place for people to go. People can work very effectively from home. I do question the idea that's out there a lot in the discourse about innovation. Innovation can only be done around the whiteboard. I've heard this so many times. What about the whiteboard? What about the guys around the whiteboard? Innovation doesn't just come from the guys around the whiteboard. And I'm a big believer in understanding different people's approaches to work. Not everybody likes that environment. Not everybody is great at coming up with the great idea on the spot. So remote work, it's a leveler. It brings in people who maybe are more thoughtful, more measured in how they give their opinions on things. So yes, I think using the office space, redesigning office space for collaboration, but doing it carefully, doing it intentionally. If it's for collaboration, bringing everyone in on board, making sure no one is left out, that's key.
Tatiana, yeah, great.
Well, first I wanted just to resonate with what John said in terms of innovation. Yeah, at least our data suggests that actually people who were continuing to work in the office during pandemic were much less creative, and there might be contextual explanations for this as well, essential jobs and a lot of pressure. But anyways, I think it definitely talks to your point, John. But I was thinking of this question you asked, Jennifer, like what would be one practical advice that I would give? And I think my advice would be around very purposeful job design. If you're going to move some roles to hybrid or to fully remote, you really need to think very carefully what are the responsibilities and that everybody is clear, both the employee and the managers. Because what our data says, just maybe to interpret a little bit, when we say that the hybrid people have highest role conflict, it means that they receive conflicting requests for their time, and the different people are asking them to do different things that are sometimes at conflict with each other. And when we talk about role overload and saying that hybrid people have the highest role overload, it means that they have more requests to their time than they have hours in a day. And when you actually look at it in combination with the task visibility, they have lower task visibility, meaning that their managers don't know what they're actually doing. You can kind of see, well, this nicely comes together. They are experiencing these high pressures because their managers are not really aware what they're doing. And therefore they're throwing at them multiple things. And it all leads to this, role conflict and role overload. So going forward, if you're going to, I think for hybrid to work well, you really need to purposefully think, what is the role? What do we expect this person to do? and that it's clear for everyone, both on the both sides of the equation. So then we can relieve them from this additional pressure.
I think that's a great point, Tatiana. Thank you. I think it's really important actually in remote or hybrid, that idea of understanding role clarity and redesigning or looking at those roles and what their purpose is. That actually feeds into a question that we had from the audience there around how can we go about developing managers to embrace remote first? So open to the panel, how can we go about developing managers to embrace remote first?
I might go first on that. Just been thinking about it when I saw Carol post it there. It's there's a lot of things you can do. I'm going to touch on 2 or 3 things. One, it feeds back to exactly what Tatiana was saying there. Have a really clear roles and responsibilities for all your staff. So whether they're in the office or out, and I know that sounds obvious, but with people that are working in a hybrid model, I fear that they feel they have to work twice as hard to prove themselves. And so when you don't have visibility of what they're doing, they end up working longer hours and working late at home and being online to show that I'm online and I am working and stuff. We need to get away from that whole concept. So it's about, if you have a really clear role and responsibility, if you have something like a shared calendar. So for managers, they need to start being able to trust people and to be able to delegate well. So shared calendars are really useful, and you ask people to map out their times, and you can book in scheduled sessions and meetings with them. Video calls, and we do things like something similar, like simple like daily stand-ups, where you just get to talk to your team every morning for 15 minutes, make sure we're all on track, we know what we're doing, and then move on with the day. And then you might do one in the evening as well, just to check in, but it's not a check up, it's a check in. You're making sure that you're okay, you have the support you need, that nobody should be working from home and they don't get a check-in from somebody every day. That's always our worry. I don't want to be at home working on my own, and people need to make sure that you're still alive and you're still there and you're okay. So things like that, improve your comms, over communicate. There's no such thing as too much communication with someone working remotely, with both of you working remotely or wherever you are. Over communicate. So find something like, we use Slack. We live in Slack. We don't really use email. Everything is on Slack. And you find ways to make that work so you're not interrupting people's day all the time. But over communicate, clear roles and responsibilities, and just get that little bit of trust that these people you've hired them to do a job, let them do it and let them prove themselves.
Thanks.
I completely agree on the trust. I think trust is key. I think it was yesterday, I saw an article in The Economist urging employees not to ask for Mondays or Fridays as the days they want to work from home in case it would harm their careers. And I immediately thought, where's the trust there? Are we still a year and a half in with remote working in a place where we think working from home is not working? You're taking a long weekend. I mean, you're still working when you work from home. So I think it's about trust. It's about assuming people are working equally hard, probably harder, as Helen just touched on, whether they're working remote or working in the office.
That's, Joanne, it's funny that you mentioned that, because about 3 years ago, myself and another senior person at Shopify went to meet the senior leadership team at a major company that's based on the western seaboard of Ireland. And we met the talent VP and the VP of engineering. And they proudly talked about the fact that they had remote working, which really was kind of hybrid. It was flexible working as far as they were concerned, which was the ability to, they allowed people work from home when the leaders chose. And they were and then they turned to us and said, but of course we don't allow it on Mondays and Fridays, because and we actually said, no, we don't know. Explain why. And there was a really interesting kind of standoff, because we were their guests in their office and they thought it was a little bit impolite for us to say that, but we had to call them out on it, because it clearly was a case of lack of trust, purely and simply. So to Helene's point, trust, transparency and visibility are incredibly important. If you don't have an open calendar, then you're not trusting in your own employees, period, end of story. I mean, that's where it starts and finishes in my book. From a visibility perspective, the quick 15-minute pop-up meetings in the morning or stand-up meetings in the morning, absolutely fantastic. And it's funny, Helene, that you mentioned that it's a check-in, not a check-up. One of the terms that I've heard used at Shopify is it's a time to check in, not a time to check out, right? And very, very similar kind of in terminology. We also have had teams who do a check-in at the end of the day as well. They do one at the start and one at the end, and they actually discuss what they've accomplished. And you know, from a tech support team, some of the tech support teams actually do that, and they do a kind of review of the tickets that they've gone through in the day, so that they're actually able to provide as a team an insight into what the customers around the world are actually feeling and hearing about the product that day. One thing I would say to Carol's question about how can you develop managers, I think one of the key things is to encourage, to make people comfortable that the technology that they're using today is already obsolete. There are people working on advancing that technology, and quite significantly. The Google Meet of this year, the Zoom of this year is quite a good bit better than it was last year. Many of the aspects of it you see, but many of the aspects of it you don't see, and it will continue to evolve. Another thing is that the remote work you've been doing for the last 15 or 16 months, that's not remote work. That is absolutely crazy survival in the middle of a pandemic with your laptop, a lollipop stick, and some chewing gum. That's really what you've been doing for the last 16 months. Deep, intentional, planned remote work is quite different. And I think the point that has been echoed by everybody on the panel today is, once you set up from a mindset perspective of being remote first, it's okay completely to execute a hybrid policy, provided the ultimate goal or the thing that underpins it is remote first. If it's wishy-washy hybrid first, you're actually about as useful as an ashtray and a motorbike. It just is not a good policy. It really doesn't work, in my opinion.
Thank you, John. And
if I can quickly say to this question about how we can develop managers, first of all, I fully agree with what has been said. I just thought I can share one more story that I think enriches the points already made. With this thing of task visibility and the lack of it, where we could actually train managers and develop them, on the one hand, what Helen and John were talking about, these regular check-ins, but also how it spills over then in performance appraisal and then further in promotions. And I recently had an interesting conversation with one of the HR directors of quite a big company here in Ireland. And he mentioned to me that he found that the performance appraisals, they have a very sophisticated, kind of well-developed system in the company. The performance appraisals that came in the last 15 months, he was seriously considering whether they can be trusted, because he could see a difference that the people who were in hybrid or in the office, because this is a production company, so that they had some people on the premises, in their performance appraisals, the managers were putting some comments and explaining why the employee received this or that grade. But the people who worked fully remote, they just received a grade that on average was lower than the others, and there were no comments. So from a HR perspective, they couldn't make sense of these performance appraisals. And he, I think very rightly, was worried that making any decisions right now on these performance appraisals forms would be discriminating people who worked remotely. And I think it illustrates nicely one of the aspects that we need to be educating managers. How do I give this feedback to people whom I haven't met in the last 15 months? So it is useful for them and for their career development.
Thank you, Tatiana. Thank you to all of the panel, and thank you to the audience. I'm conscious of time, so I just want to wrap up. I hope there was learning in what what the panel shared with you today, and I think resonating and kind of echoing what everybody has said. We're going to all continue learning as we go through the next year and beyond. But let's do it together, and let's try and support each other. And I think Grow Remote and the types of experts that are on the panel today offer us the opportunity to do that together and to try and adopt the best practices we can in going forward. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you to the panel again, and look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks a million, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Joanne. Thanks, Renata.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.